Hey friends, I wanted to take a moment to tell you about my new book, Negotiation Made Simple. For the past 20 years, I have helped business people put together important deals, lawyers settle big lawsuits, small business owners grow their business by getting the most value for their product possible. And through this, I've learned a process on how to use negotiation to deliver outstanding deals. This particular book is those 20 years and everything I've learned about negotiation that's packaged in a very practical guide for solving problems, building relationships, and delivering the next deal. I hope you will jump in, buy this book, read this book, put it to work, and in doing so, you will be equipped to get better negotiation outcomes and to get what you want, not only in business, but in life as well. Go purchase Negotiation Made Simple wherever you buy books and use 2024 as an opportunity to take your next step in your negotiation success. Welcome to Negotiation Made Simple, where we help you master the art of negotiation and win the next deal. I'm your host, John Lowry. On today's episode, we are going to step into the world of conflict. No one likes to talk about conflict, yet everyone acknowledges it all around them. And so today, what I want to do is to take a very high-level view and to walk you through what I call the conflict continuum, which are all the different ways that society deals with conflict. And then in the context of that, talk about the importance of negotiation in managing conflict, not only personally and the disputes that we have in our lives, but also think about how we can use negotiation to create more peace in our country and in the world at large. So let's jump into this conversation. It will be the first of a 3-part series where we dig into thinking about how we can use negotiation to deal with the conflict in our lives and create more peace in our world. On this episode, I want to spend some time thinking about something that I call the conflict continuum. I did not make this up. Other people have thought about this, but I want to walk people through kind of the continuum of how conflict is managed. And then I want to think a little bit about where we are as a country right now and share some ideas in terms of how we might be able to get back on track in terms of using this continuum. So the most popular way that people deal with conflict is to avoid it. It's comfortable, it's easy, it is the most natural approach, is just to stay away from it and hope that it goes away or whatever the dynamics are, disappear. The challenge with avoidance is it doesn't work very well. And instead of the conflict disappearing, what happens is the conflict will escalate. And as a result of that, there's nothing productive that happens, and avoidance becomes a flawed strategy. And so despite its shortcomings, the reality is because it's the most comfortable, that's what you see most in a world of conflict. If you want to escalate just a little bit, one of the things that's available to everyone, and this is a very healthy approach to kind of dealing with some sort of conflict, is to simply talk about it, to open up the lines of communication and to have some discussion. This can be very informal. I remember one of my old bosses, when you brought the old boss a problem and you had an issue with a colleague or there was a disagreement over something, or there were different perspectives and you were bringing it to the boss to kind of make the decision. I remember he used to always say, "Have you been to Starbucks?" And those of us that worked for him knew exactly what that meant. And what that meant was, have you taken the person with whom you have the disagreement or with whom you share a very different perspective, and have you taken them to Starbucks and had a cup of coffee and talked about it? Because he did not want to intervene. He did not want to make a decision unless he knew that there had been good communication already around whatever the problem or whatever the issue is. And so frankly, just opening up the lines of communication, there is a ton of conflict, a ton of disagreement that actually can get resolved by just doing that. Because what people learn is that a lot of perceived conflict is actually just a misunderstanding or perhaps a miscommunication. And it's very easy to clear those kinds of things up when you just go and have some conversation about them. Now, if you need a process that's a little more formal than that, but still based in conversation, still based in open communication, that's where negotiation comes in. The subject of this podcast and the subject of my recent book, Negotiation Made Simple. This is communication, but it's strategic communication for a purpose. You are trying to accomplish something. You are managing a process around that communication that is leading to an outcome. And so negotiation is a very healthy, very effective way of dealing with conflict. And we'll see how at the end of this, we'll see the important role that negotiation plays at every stage of the conflict continuum. But it is something that is available to all of us. It's something that not many of us are skilled in doing. But if we can elevate the skills of everybody in terms of their ability to negotiate, conflict will become less costly. Our country can be more united. Businesses and organizations can make more money. There can be more peace. Lots of good can happen in this world if we can elevate the role of negotiation. Now, the next stage, which again is a bit more formal, is in the legal world, we call this mediation. And it's the process in which 95+% of lawsuits get settled, is they will get settled out of court, usually in the context of mediation. There are many courts now that order parties to go to mediation before the court will hear their dispute. And mediation is nothing more than a facilitated negotiation. It's where you bring someone else in to help the communication process, to help lead the process that is working towards some sort of resolution or some sort of agreement. Now, mediation is not just reserved for the legal world. Mediation happens all the time. So many times parents will mediate between two kids, or you'll have a boss that mediates between two employees. And it's not a formal process, it's informal, but the process is the same. And it's this idea of inviting a third party to come in to help deal with a contentious issue or a broken relationship or an issue that is divisive. And so there's lots of counselors out there. And counselors, while they're doing something under the umbrella of counseling, what they're actually doing is mediating. They're helping people find a way to resolve differences and solve problems. Now, the next step is a bit more formal. And in the legal world, this is what's called arbitration. And this is where you actually bring a third party in to make a decision. The parties will empower that person or that panel of people to make the decision to help resolve their dispute. And so you see a lot of this in terms of international business, but you also see a lot of it in terms of consumer transactions. And so if you have a credit card or you own a stock or you have a cell phone, chances are you have probably signed on to an arbitration agreement. And if there's a dispute around your cell phone contract or around the purchase of that stock or whatever, it is probably headed to arbitration to get resolved. But again, arbitration is not reserved for the legal field. Arbitration happens in other areas as well. And so this is where a manager or a boss makes a decision. And there's disagreement or there's different ideas in terms of how the company should move forward. And here you have the board or the CEO or whoever it is that says, here is what we're going to do. It is a form of arbitration, and it's one of the ways in which conflict is dealt with. One of the downsides to arbitration is if you have someone that makes the decision, you create a dynamic to where there are winners and losers. And many times the winners are emboldened and the losers become disengaged. And so that's one of the downsides of arbitration. Arbitration is also a private process. It's a process that the parties can select who is going to be the person that makes the decision. Next is when we bring the dispute into the public sphere. This is litigation. And so again, in the legal world, this would be the next place to go if you're not able to resolve your dispute, would be to enter and engage the court system. And the court system makes the decisions. And it makes the decisions in civil cases, and it makes the decisions in criminal cases as well. And it determines how much money should be paid or how much time should be served, whatever the case might be. But this is the litigation process. It's more formal. It's governed. You have judges that administer it. You have lawyers that have to be licensed in order to engage in it. And there's a formality around it. The downside of the formality is, as you have it, you drive costs up. And so litigation is a very, very expensive process for people. But it is one of the popular ways in which our society resolves conflict, is through litigation. Then there is legislation. This enters into the political world, to where we have legislatures at the state level and at the federal level, and we usually have commissioners or council people at the more local level. And these bodies are responsible for making policy, for making law, for making decisions that impact the community. And they work through a process in which people are elected and people represent parts of the community or the population, and people vote. And there are all sorts of different processes and protocols in terms of what amount of votes are required in order for something to become law or something to pass. Whatever the case might be, there is a whole legislative process. And this process can be very difficult as well, because this process, you have to usually win a majority, or you have to win a supermajority in order to be successful working through this process. Many people don't have access to this process because they just don't have the resources to be able to engage all of the different people that have to be engaged in order to be successful in terms of moving an issue through it. But this is the process that literally our forefathers and our country's founders set up for us, at least at the national level. And then this is the process that is what's used for more state and local governance as well. Now, this is where this continuum becomes interesting, because everything we've talked about so far, these are kind of sanctioned, very acceptable processes that are available for people to use to pursue grievances, to pursue injustice, to get decisions made, to resolve disputes, all these different things. There's as you can see, a long list of processes that are available to people. But I think more and more in today's times, we're seeing people that are deciding to do something different. They don't feel empowered by these more institutional sanctioned processes. And so you see more and more folks that are starting to take things into their own hands. And this is becoming a popular way of how conflict is being pursued and how people are trying to resolve it. And one of those ways is what I call self-help, to where people are taking things into their own hands. And here's where you see more protest and things like this. And this kind of ebbs and flows. Back in COVID, there was a lot of protest. Haven't seen as many over the last year or so. But this is a process that people are using on a more regular basis in terms of pursuing differences or pursuing things that they feel are unjust. I'll never forget one of my favorite examples of self-help actually came from a Ford dealership. And I remember one morning I drove by this Ford dealership. I was on a way to a soccer game. And there was this Ford Mustang that was parked out in front of this Ford dealership. And it was a convertible Mustang. The top was down, and someone had built and painted this huge A-frame sign that was sitting in this convertible Mustang. And that sign said, "I got ripped off." And that's all it said. And so you were driving by this Ford dealership, you saw this Mustang, you saw this sign, and you could kind of connect the dots. Someone bought that car from that dealership. There's something wrong with that car. You guess that they tried to get it resolved, but couldn't. And as a result of the fact that whatever process they pursued didn't provide a sufficient or a satisfactory solution, they decided to take things into their own hands. And they created this sign and they sent this message to all the people that were going to come look at a car that day, that at least their experience was they got ripped off. Now, after my soccer game, I drove back down the same road, and it was now 3 or 4 hours later, and the car was gone. And so I began thinking about, well, I wonder what happened. And my guess is, I don't know if I'm right, but my guess is that someone picked up the phone and there was some conversation with that car owner, and they got something worked out to the point that the car owner came, removed their car, removed their sign, and allowed that dealership to then move through its day in a normal way. Sometimes, and in many cases, very tragically, self-help can go too far and actually become violence. Or in the case of a country, it could be something like war. And here is where we start to see the cost of conflict, where you see people that are being killed. You see innocent people that are being harmed or having their lives completely disrupted, if not ended, by the violence that is occurring. And every time I see something like this on the news, every world event that I hear about, I just think, I wonder if there is a better way. I wonder why all of these different processes failed that led us to a point like this, to where now humanity is resorting to killing each other in order to resolve their differences or establish who's right and who's wrong. And yet it's been happening this way ever since history's been recorded. And so there's nothing new in it, but it seems like as we grow in sophistication, we can grow in sophistication in terms of the processes that we use to create peace as well. Now, not as much in this century, but back in the 20th century, if you were going to bring a war to an end, it would usually happen with a treaty. And that treaty was negotiated. And so if we start to work back through this continuum, here's the thing that I hope you will recognize with me, is that at least for a lot of centuries, wars were brought to an end through negotiation. If we think about self-help, usually we might have whatever the action is that draws attention or creates a challenge for one of the parties involved. But once we get through that moment, usually it's a negotiation that brings some resolution to that moment. If you think about legislation, well, our legislative bodies, that's what they do all day long, is you've got senators and representatives and congresswomen, all of who just simply negotiate all day long, trying to work deals, trying to make things happen, trying to get their bills passed. And so negotiation's at the essence of legislation as well. If you think about litigation, again, most of the lawsuits that are filed that enter the litigation process, 95% of them or more will be solved through some form of settlement negotiation. And so negotiation is critical to that process. Mediation, arbitration, it's negotiated how people get into these processes, and then the basis for these processes and all the details around them, it's all negotiation. And so as you think about this entire conflict continuum with me, I hope you will see the importance of negotiation. And as we think about our country, as we think about our world, as we think about all the threats that exist, as we think about all of the injustices that are playing out, as you just reflect on everything with me, one of the things that I think can be an antidote to all this war and all this division and all of this hatred and all of this is negotiation. If we can learn how to negotiate again in good faith, it will eliminate the need for violence. And yet we have to be real about it in terms of we have to truly empower people in the negotiation process. Because if they don't feel like there's any hope that there's a good outcome through that process, they won't engage it and they'll move to something else that is far more destructive. As we think about restoring Washington to what it once was, and to get it out of where it is in the cycle of division that we just see growing and growing and growing, we've got to get our legislative representatives to a place to where they can negotiate again. We have to give people space to compromise. And right now, politicians don't feel like there's any space to compromise. And as a result of that, we begin to see the dysfunction that is going to continue to be a problem. We continue to see issues in our country that seem to never get resolved. They will continue to be issues and they will get worse if we can't find a way to negotiate. And so one of the things that I want to do is to really call upon people to think about how to take this process of negotiation more seriously, to think about how to become more skilled and more prepared to bring negotiation to the table, to bring it as a process to deal with some of the most difficult issues that are out there, and to give people the space and empower them to truly negotiate, which means there will have to be some level of give and take, which means there's going to have to be some level of creativity, which means we're going to have to pay attention to people's interests, not just their positions and their issues, but we're going to have to spend some time listening, not just going on cable television and articulating for the 29th millionth time a particular position. It means that we've got to find a way to where we really can have some civil and substantive dialogue around issues. And it also means we've got to learn how to think differently and not just be stuck in ideological avenues, but to really think about how it is that we can be responsive to each other in a way that actually lifts everyone up. Now, I know all of that sounds idealistic, and you're very right to say, John, that's a dream world. That is not the world we live in. I am totally with you. But we have to start thinking about how we start to begin to move towards the solution as opposed to just find ourselves stuck in the problem. You see, negotiation is the way that we can become victors over all the challenges ahead of us as opposed to just sitting back and being victims. And so, as we think about this podcast, as we think about the subject of negotiation, I want to motivate you to dig in, to build the negotiation skills within you. Yes, I want you to use those to make more money and to grow your business and to do the things on the business side of life that you need to do. But today, my heart is at a place to where I want to try to help you develop these skills so that you can bring about peace in your communities, so that you can be an instrument of peace, not only to your family, but also to the people around you. And maybe get to the place to where you become an instrument of peace in our institutions of government and in some of the spaces where people are very, very skeptical right now, where there's a lot of discord and division and there's not much healthy interaction. I think with good people who have good motives, who are skilled in understanding how to overcome some of the craziness that we see and can invite people and engage people in a process that is healthy, the process of negotiation, I think we can begin to take some steps to get our country back on track, to get to a place to where we can again start finding some common ground in terms of what we're about. And as a result of that, we can see some of these issues actually get dealt with. We can see some of the challenges be overcome. We can see some of the people who are being left out have a place and have a voice. And as a result of that, we can pursue that more perfect union that we've been pursuing for decades and decades and decades. And so I invite you to join me in thinking about how we negotiate more effectively so that we can accomplish the things in life that we want to accomplish, and that the generations that are in charge today can proudly one day, as they hand off these institutions of power to other generations, can do so by saying, they're yours now. We've given them to you in a way that is better than we found them, and we wish you well as you pursue the future. Well, this episode has provided a big calling in terms of thinking about how it is that we can use negotiation to really bring about peace in our society and to help get our country back on the right track. What I want to do for those of you that are serious and thinking about this with me, what I want to do is I want to invite you to the next couple of episodes where we will think more practically about how we can use negotiation to better manage conflict in our personal lives, but then also think about how we can use negotiation to better manage some of that conflict and some of those issues that seem to plague our society as well. Thank you for listening. I wish you well in your negotiation endeavors, and join us on the next episode of Negotiation Made Simple as we think about how to use this process to make a difference and to do good in our world.